Okay, here we are in the exciting world of trying to get started in a rush here. Evolution Hour, our opening bit. One of these days, we're going to have music for this. We'll cross those bridges when we come to it. Hope you see my little word press.com site flash by. That's Troubles in Paradise, the Methodology of Creationism project. We will now stop sharing and begin the exciting world I was thinking about talking about. I'm in sort of a cold mood here. Forget my Obi-Wan Kenobi look here. It's trying to ration my furnace heat. I just got back from Christmas with my niece over in Seattle, and so I was in a little bit of a rush and was thinking, what the hell should I be talking about here? And one thing that I really thought was relevant to kind of focus on was the nuts and bolts of what it means to do scholarly method and why, if I can do it, anybody can do it. It's not rocket science, even if it involves rocket science. So I put just one measly little link in the video description, which is to an editorial in Nature magazine just from this last week, which is referring to some climate change science that has just popped up. And they had links in the editorial about it to these 3 different open access papers on recent climate science research, which suggests that you can, in fact, trace climate change to actual global warming caused by human beings, which had been thought, yeah, kind of hard to do. And this is a perfect gateway opportunity for looking at how you approach any subject. It doesn't have to be about climate science. It could be paleontology. It could be genetics. It could be a legal paper. It could be absolutely anything. It's the same method. It's not separate. The basic principle is you can use a gateway like an editorial or a commentary piece. It can be something on the internet, doesn't matter, that is talking about a more technical subject. And if you can plow your way through the commentary piece without any gears scraping from a lack of comprehension, then you're okay to move on to the next step, which is to look at what the original source is. So I just took that example of the climate change stuff because it was new information that I was plugging into TIP anyway. Because climate change methodologically intersects with anti-evolutionism and all sorts of things that I've talked on before. But the methodology is all the same. So any subject you want to veer into, if you feel that, oh gosh, this is above my pay grade, I can't understand what they're talking about, start at the bottom and work your way up. So you can take a look at a commentary piece like the one that I put the link up to and read through that and see if there's anything that's problematic about it or not. If you have the luxury to being able to print it out, and you can underline terms you may not understand or subject matter you're going, is that right? Question mark. And then, of course, look up the papers. They're all open access, so anybody can download them. And then you can move up to the next level, which is to read through the technical paper and see how much of it you get a grip on and how much you don't. Believe me, every technical area is going to have some spots where your eyes are glazing over and going, what the hell are they talking about? But that's not a roadblock, in my opinion. That's just an opportunity. It's something where you now go, oh, I need to figure out more about that. Or if I don't know enough to be able to figure that out, I got to do some more background research on things. So terminology, you can do Google searches. You can find out a Wikipedia page on it. Nothing wrong with Wikipedia. I use it all the time. Not as the destination, but as a guidepost to find out what the common viewpoint is. What are the commonly cited works, etc. What's the terminology about? And then you can leap off of that and eventually get grounded in primary material. So let's go wandering over here in the side commentaries to see what we go on. Opal says, yeah, this is a good topic. I know climate change deniers. They told me that we should be having an early winter thins years from 2 years ago. Never confuse climate and weather. And even when it was warm all over the planet, for all practical purposes, during the dinosaur period, it still got cold at the poles and snowed. It still snows at high altitude, regardless of how hot the climate gets. That's why you can have snowballs in Hawaii, because there's mountains that are really tall. And so the idea that every place on the planet is all going to turn into your oven on cleanup cycle is just silly. What it does involve is the whole idea about how temperatures be transformed in the atmosphere and in the oceans. And one of the things that just from following the work that popped up is how complicated working out climate was because we've got liquid water oceans. And particularly because the oceans don't stay completely put. Continents are moving, and therefore the relative distribution of them changes over time. So if you're looking at something back in the dinosaur period, continents aren't quite the same as they are now. And so you have different transformations of how things are moving across along the equator. The huge Tethya Sea, which is kind of where the southern part of Asia is now, and the fact that so much of Europe was isolated archipelago islands. It wasn't a continent at that time. There was a giant seaway that went up through Nebraska. So that's when Kansas was beachfront property. All of that enters into the complexity of trying to work all the stuff out. Opal said, and they were claiming that an ice age was coming. Yeah, there's actually an interesting story about that because it's partly still true. If you look at a long-term climate trend, we really are on the verge of the end of an interstadial, which is the time frame between ice age cycles. And typically they last around 10,000 years. And guess what? We're about 10,000 years since the ice age ended. So it was not preposterous to suppose that, yeah, we might be sliding back into an ice age eventually. And when they started to look at some climate data that was coming in as they were looking at more and more detail from Greenland and other spots, it looked like there was a drop in temperature, which there was. And that was leading some climatologists in the 60s and early 70s to suspect that, uh-oh, here we go, we'll be flipping back into an ice age. If you look at it, George Will, the political commentator, would put this out every once in a while. There was an article in Newsweek, and you still see it used by climate change deniers to this day. It's I finally found the whole text so I could see what they were talking about. But if you compare that little chart they had in that Newsweek article, where the thing was dropping down and there was a little teeny hookup at the end of the graph. If you compare that data stream against what we now know temperatures are, none of the data in that little Newsweek article was wrong. But that little hook at the bottom was actually the start of a climb, which is what we're in now. So it wasn't that any of that data was invalid. It's that it was part of a bigger picture. The other issue is that most of the modern climate modeling, if you run it out with climate change warming up because of human intervention, over 2,000 or 3,000 years, eventually that feeds back on other loops, which actually helps bring on that ice age that's going to come eventually, because larger climate patterns aren't even maneuverable necessarily by human intervention. That eventually you get feedback loops going in the poles because temperatures can rise in one area and cause stuff to cool down in the southern hemisphere. That's why some of the Antarctic glaciers have enlarged. Not all of them, most of them haven't, but a few of them had. And some of the ice flow down there gets into things because you get feedback loops because most of the water's in the southern hemisphere and most of the land's in the northern hemisphere. And stuff has different albedo as to how much it reflects. Ice that forms in the southern hemisphere will reflect more radiation out and therefore get a feedback loop going, and eventually that can swamp what's going on in the northern hemisphere. So long term, ice ages will eventually come back. In the short term, 200 years, no. And so if you're living in places that are potentially underwater, it really doesn't tell you that, oh, don't worry about the water in your living room. In a few thousand years, it'll all be gone from the new ice age. Sorry, we don't live on those terms. So we're in a situation where, for one thing, the climate modeling is getting much, much better. And part of it's to do with the idea of retrodiction, which is to take, I'll have a question in there. I'm looking at the thing. I'll mention that in just a minute, just to finish this thought. That what you want to do is to be able to accurately model stuff that we know happened in the past. So one of the big issues, and it's not entirely resolved to this day, is why the ice age triggered just exactly when it did and how it did. If you look at long-term climate temperatures, you've got these things where really huge fluctuations are taking place in temperature range from cold to really cold during the Ice Age. And then about 10,000 years ago, it went whoop, and it climbed up to our present level, and relatively minor fluctuations from that point on. And they're just now starting to get a little better idea of how that works. Well, Animal Man put a question in there about any thoughts on creationists versus feathered dinosaurs. Yeah, there we go. There's all these creationists. There's Ken Ham and Kent Hovind in this corner, and a ferocious velociraptor and a bunch of eanthonithorines about ready to arm wrestle in a mud pit. That's what I'd like to see. The short form is, it's not just creationists, it's intelligent designers have this problem too. They can't allow feathered dinosaurs, because the moment you allow dinosaurs to be feathered, then that knocks a huge prop out from the argument as to where birds came from. Well, you got bipedal dinosaurs with feathers, followed by the bipedal birds with feathers that look anatomically really similar because they have tails and gastralia and toothed beaks and all this kind of stuff. And only over time does the birds that we're used to thinking of, the toothless kinds that got no long tail, show up. And we can see that process going on now in the Cretaceous period. Birds, just to give you a timeline here, we know Archaeopteryx and that gang have shown up by about 150 million years ago. And most of the data are these Lagerstätten deposits that will preserve feathers are either the Solnhofen, where you find Archaeopteryx, which is in Europe, in modern-day Germany, or these much later Cretaceous deposits in China, where you've got clear examples of feathered theropods. So from an evolutionary point of view, it seems reasonable to think that the feathers are actually developing way earlier, not too much earlier than Archaeopteryx, because of the prevalence of stray feather impressions. We start seeing feathers showing up, some of which are from birds and some of which are probably from dinosaurs. In fact, there's even a proto-feather that was predicted on evolutionary grounds that pops up in a Cretaceous block of amber. You didn't have amber in earlier periods, so you don't get things trapped in amber before there's amber. But you start having that later. And so you've got a situation where if feathered critters are really, really popular, you're going to see stray feather impressions showing up independent of whether or not they're attached to a body. And the fact that that isn't happening in the Jurassic but is happening in the Cretaceous means that it's that period when feathered critters are really starting to proliferate. We need a lot more data, and whether the fossil genie is going to be able to pull through on that one, I don't know. But developmentally, we know an awful lot about how feathers originate in these skin placodes that are the things that eventually form scales on the reptile side and hair over on the mammal side. Same genes of Sonic Hedgehog. For those of you like Azrael who have my new Evolution Slam Dunk book, they'll find I go into an awful lot about that. Alas, without pictures, but nevertheless a description of the kinds of stuff that's going on with these skin placodes and the formation of feathers. Well, anyway, your anti-evolutionists really are uncomfortable allowing feathered theropods to exist, because it really knocks an awful lot of a prop out of their arguments. So they deny it. And they've got a few evolutionists like Alan Fiducia, who I also go into in Slam Dunk, who take the interesting argument that if it's got feathers, it's got to be a bird. So any of these things that are being identified as feathered dinosaurs, they've got to redefine as flightless birds, which gets to be really strange. Just recently, in fact, brand new in that bunch from Nature magazine, is an example of, I think it was from Nature, on a new example of a feathered theropod that apparently was kind of like an aquatic mode, duck mode. But anatomically, it's effectively a feathered dinosaur. And the things that we call birds are the ones that lost their tails. They went to be exclusively toothless, although they still got little bitty itty-bitty remnants of the tooth manufacturing mechanism lurking around in their genetics, and it can be triggered off by retinoic acid and I think a bunch of other stuff that can develop that. But they basically lost the teeth and are purely beaks from now on. They've managed to take a bird beak and tweak back some of the gene switches to produce the bone structure of the archosaur dinosaurs that are the putative ancestors for birds. So you get a lot of paleogenomic retroengineering stuff going on. Feathers are fun because for a long time, they approached it from the wrong direction. And they were looking at it just in terms of the flight characteristics rather than figuring out how do feathers work out developmentally. How do they start out inside the skin, and how do they generate things which eventually fray and turn into these little barbules that link up together to form the feathers? So two guys, Prum and Brush, independently were working on this from the developmental biology end, and eventually they started teaming up because they were tracking similar areas. And then there's another bunch of scientists around this guy named Alibardi who have gone into this even more to work out in very great detail the developmental biology of how bumpy bits inside of a skin placode with keratin fibers are eventually forming feathers, and why they take the forms they do, and all the developmental biology of that. Animal Man was asking, did the same gene reversal with the tail, making it longer? Yeah, I haven't seen that work. If you got a little blurb on that, be sure to put it up in the comment section on the video. I'd like to pop around. I may have something on it in the bibliography, but as incredible as it may sound, I do not encounter absolutely everything. Nobody can cover 1,500 technical journals on a rigorous basis. I try to hit the highlights and then learn about material, and once I learn about it, I begin to plug it all in there. The bird teeth example is an interesting one because of the whole issue of why animals become toothless at all, how do teeth develop, how do enamel develop. An awful lot about evolution is tracked by the teeth because they're durable. And so often the rest of the body isn't preserved, but the teeth are. Most of the mammals that are known, particularly small ones in the early stages, are known basically by their teeth. And another fascinating thing was that they've been able to retro-engineer the genes that are producing teeth shape, basically your rat model teeth. And some of these things, because they're little cusps, there are bumps on them, they're very, very characteristic. And there's this one, I always mispronounce it, I think the tricyllophodontid or something like that bunch. I think I call them T2 in Slam Dunk. But the thing is they have very distinctive teeth cusping, and they're able to retro-engineer all of this stuff. 100 million years worth of teeth forms from relatively few tweaks about what genes were turning on and in what order. And they were able to do this experimentally. So there's just a hell of a lot of data that have mounted up about the evolution of birds, particularly everybody know my website. If they don't, you should. But 3 macroevolutionary episodes at TIP. Type all this in here. Is a free book-length work that I did quite a few years ago that covers bird evolution and the reptile-mammal transition and the Cambrian explosion. And everybody can download that little puppy. I think it's also, I think I posted it at Academia EDU too, but it's there at the main TIP website. Oh, yes, the BJ was just wondering whether this was the subject I started out with. No big deal. I was making my basic punch for everybody needs to kind of dive into the source methods approach, and it's a universal toolkit. So anybody can kind of run off of that. But the question on the feathers was quite useful, and any old opportunity to say nasty things about creationists. You'll find that there's very little difference between how Brian Thomas will be going after feathered theropods for answers in answers in Genesis or Institute for Creation Research, and how a Casey Luskin or now Beckley, their in-house insect paleontologist that's been blathering on about birds and hominids lately, is going to deal with the same subject matter. They got to find ways of eliminating the data. Opal Dragon asks a really good question, that if they reverse engineer a dinosaur, will it count towards being a dinosaur like a theropod one? Retro-engineering is not easy that far back. You can do some of the pieces, although theoretically science of the 28th century may be able to pull this stuff off, because in principle, every bird alive today carries around with it the genetic baggage of their ancestors. And the dinosaurs only died out 65 million years ago, way too long to preserve DNA, unfortunately, but not necessarily long enough to have obscured an awful lot of the bits and pieces of things. I think they'll have a better chance at resolving that interesting question of the enantornithines. These are the earliest big league birds that are coming along in the period after Archaeopteryx, so after 150 million years ago. They're the dominant birds in the early Cretaceous, in the times before there were tyrannosaurs. And they're called enantornithines. It's reverse, the opposite birds. And it has to do with the fact that the shoulder thing is the reverse. Instead of the socket being on one side and the cusp on the other, it's reversed. And as far as I can tell from the technical literature, nobody's really thought through how that's possible. What genetic switches are occurring. And it's presumably occurring in a particular lineage fairly early on. It'll be fun for them to figure out exactly how far back that goes. The other thing that's been a real big revolution in understanding of bird evolution is how many non-birds are coming out of those feathered theropods. Because every time you turn around, Microraptor was the first big splash. If you're familiar with the old Archaeoraptor hoax that occurred around 1999, the creationists still riff off of. Ironically, it was formed from two slabs of something. One was a bird and one was apparently a dinosaur that they just slammed together to make a chimera that would sell to gullible paleontologists, of which it turned out to be not so many as they thought, because science and nature were very skeptical of it. And it finally got in National Geographic, and Alan's Circus was the main guy who just recently died. He was kind of sucked in on this desire to have this as being a thing, and made the cover of National Geographic, and pretty soon blew up in their face because Stoll Sorson over at the Smithsonian, who's always been skeptical of the bird dinosaur model, basically started poking holes in it, quite rightly so. And so they realized, oops, this was not really a single fossil after all. But turned out the pieces were more interesting than the fake, because both of the fossils were real, and the one that was the dinosaur-y one was actually a Microraptor, which turned out, as they've later found full specimens of these things, they're a little itty-bitty thing, crow-sized kind of, that has wings on both front and hind limbs, feathers, big flight feathers on both front and hind limbs. There's no modern bird that does that. And so it's probably not on the direct bird lineage, but it's suggesting that flappy things with feathers on them are probably developing in various lineages. The enantornithines being just the dominant one, and then the ones that we now know as the ornithines, the ones that lead to all existing birds that survived the mass extinction. As far as I know, none of the enantornithines made it. Raptors or any of these others went extinct. So there's still lots of lessons to be worked out as they find out more and more samplings of things and where they do. One big question for me is, how widespread was Archaeopteryx? All of the Archaeopteryx fossils are from one deposit, the Solnhofen in Germany. And so we don't know where it lived. There's at least two species. One of the ones that have been found in most recently is enough different from the standard Archaeopteryx to suggest that there were two species that were knocking around in there. Basically, it's an anoxic lake that various things would just suddenly splash into and drop dead. And they would sink down into the bottom, and they wouldn't get decayed, and that's what they end up with, and then eventually flatten down into lithographic limestone, and that's where they find a lot of these things. Same thing for the Mesel deposit, also in Germany, but that's 50 million years ago. It's much later, and by that time, mammals are in charge. So we don't know how active and how widespread the Archaeopterygids were, how many species or genera might have been involved, and their roots in the dinosaurs. There is a suspicion, and Alan Fiducia, who is a bird guy, has legitimately pointed out how birds apparently diversify more in island hopping and in not continental range. And so there's a suspicion, given how fragmented Europe was at that time, that a lot of early bird evolution is involving isolated niches and islands. But we just don't have enough, because little itty-bitty birds, anything that's the size of a crow or a pigeon, has very small bones have very bad fossil record. That's true for small theropods too. And so trying to piece all of that stuff together when the odds of them being preserved are pretty slim make it tougher. So the big question mark for bird evolution is what's going on before 150 million years ago to that period of probably about 170 million years ago. And we don't know a hell of a lot about that. One of these days, they may actually get up to there. Old Scratch asked, do you think any flightless birds survived the extinction? Oh, yeah. And in fact, in South America in particular, Diatrema, I think, is the name of one of these killer birds, these monstrous 10, 12-foot tall things. They were the main predators in South America for millions of years until the Isthmus of Panama formed. And then all of those new panthers and cats that had evolved up in the northern America part suddenly had a way to get down south, and they were able to outcompete the birds. But for millions of years, the killer predator of South America were these huge flightless birds. They're a nasty little bunch. And a big, the specific types that we would think of for the Deinonychid types, your sickle cell, or not sickle cell, but sickle claw types, your velociraptor cliche from the Jurassic Park movies. How many of those could have survived, and why small dinosaurs, if feathering was fairly common as an insulation thing, why did all of the non-flying dinosaurs die out? And that's still not entirely clear why that's the case. Yeah, the Animal Man points out, yes, the Diatrema is now called Gastornis, and it's not even a terror bird or even in South America. Oh, darn. Well, I know there are some down there in South America during the Eocene or whenever it was, before the Isthmus of Panama formed, so know that part. Whether they have much range beyond that's another matter, and whether there were ones in other sections of the world, I haven't looked into the paleontology that much. Animal Man also asked, I've never seen non-evolutionists complain about quaternary ice age creatures like mammoths, ground sloths, cave hyenas, and more. Do you know why, or make a good guess? Oh, partly because they don't study them. That's one point. Two, they're kind of stuff that's lurking around in the tropes about what they think is going on with stuff. So mammoths are the ones they think that are, they're being flash frozen in oh, gonna go for it just showed up, Peter. Mammoths were part of creationist lore as supposedly being flash frozen at the time of the flood. And they don't really think much about the other cave bears and all the big Pleistocene fauna, and that they're not that familiar with it. They just kind of go for the big stars like the mammoths and mastodons. They're not really concerned with too much of the fiddly bit details in there, as they are with any of this other stuff. All you need to do when you bump into any anti-evolutionist, whether they're creationist or intelligent designer, if you know more about your own working map of time than they do, you can ask pointed questions to find out what's in their map of time. And $9 to a hole in a donut, there's nothing there. They will only know some big names of things that pop up in their lore. They're not really investigating on their own. Elephants are a broad-ranging group. We're living in a very impoverished environment post-Ice Age, some of which got impoverished a bit more because humans were really good at hunting and eliminated some critters along the way as they spread around the world. But there was already collapsing ecosystems following the Ice Age anyway. But most of the critters that we see, like crocodiles and others today, are just a slim reflection of how diverse they were earlier. Sharks were more diverse earlier. A lot of animals. So it's not just on land. Oh, Justin. Hello, Justin. He's talking about flying dinosaurs, my favorite. Unfortunately, still works. So he's coming by my house because my niece and their family have been pissed off that I don't have a phone, that I can't afford one. And so they're finding ways to sneak me around it. So they gave me one of these new smartphones, but now I have to find out how to connect it up to a Wi-Fi so that I can connect it to the internet, so I can find a way to getting the free phone service so that I don't have to worry about being there just in case the couch catches on fire. And they seem to be terribly concerned about these sorts of things. So he hopefully will be able to get it over there at one point. Yeah, BJ asks, I wonder how they would explain elephants being related to hyraxes. Well, it's just a matter of scale. Everything is related to everything when you think about it. So it's just a matter of just how close to the family tree are they willing to deal with stuff. It's fair to say that any creationist will not allow anything that looks really different to be closely related to anything that looks really different. So put a hyrax and an elephant together, and they're not going to want to see a common ancestor somewhere down the road on that one. Put it something that's close to a hyrax or something that's elephant-like close to it, then they can say, well, it's just the same kind, and resolve it. Now, if you're talking intelligent designers, they don't care a rat's ass about any of that. They never do systematics. There is no such thing as intelligent design taxonomy. So they just fluff it off and only pay attention to the kind of the star stuff. On the issue about trying to debunk them like the dinosaurs, anti-evolutionists in general pick stuff that gets to be popular. So mastodons are relatively popular. Cave bears are not. And try to find too much on myocids, which are the ancestors of the carnivores, cats and dogs, and all that bunch in the anti-evolution lore, in the creationist lore. Most of the dinosaurs aren't discussed. There's a hell of a lot of those. You'll find a few anal retentive picky types who will kind of comment snarky about some of the stuff, but they don't have a model to work with. It's not a matter of a clear baraminology framework that has worked out rigorously how to define what a kind is, and that they will take the new animal that pops up and they will figure out how to connect it up to the dots. No, they're not anywhere near that. There's numbers will be thrown around. Noah's Ark thing down there in Kentucky will say that there's 1,500 created kinds on the Ark. Now, this is Answers in Genesis. And if you look around in other parts of Answers in Genesis, they've got people saying there are 8,500 created kinds. Neither one of them give any lists. So we don't know what they mean. They're just kind of generic numbers that they pull out of their hat or their ass or somewhere, some orifice. And that's about as far as it goes. I won't see that one. So if it eventually was to the point where people on our side are so persnickety detailed that we won't let them not notice all those other animals, they're going to have to kind of figure it out. And they're going to not be able to figure it out because there's no model there. They can't apply something that's completely useless, that's completely ad hoc, that's meaningless. Because anything they do, raise your hand metaphorically if you know what baraminology is. I'll type the word in there, just in case you haven't heard about it. I've been using it quite a lot, and I've done a bunch of little things on it and some stuff with baraminology is from the Hebrew neologism baramin, for kind. And it was developed by a creationist in the 40s named Marsh, who pretty soon found out that there was too many animals to accommodate and kind of gave up on it. Well, there's a whole bunch of young Turk creationists, Kurt Wise and Kavanaugh Wood and these others, who gave it the New College try back in the 1990s on. And they've done a few baraminology papers. If you go through my hashtag tip bibliography and word search for baramin or baraminology, you'll find a bunch of papers on the subject. And they've done a little here and a little there. I went through the one that this one guy, Aaron, did on therapsids, the one and only one, and analyzed just how completely evasive it was. And that's their top of the heap, that they're never really going to be able to make it all fit because everything is related by natural branching common descent. So they're either going to have to arbitrarily stop looking at some point. That's what Wood and Kavanaugh did when they basically allowed the entire horse sequence to be part of a baramin, a monobaramin as they call it. And that's disastrous, because if you can go all the way from little Horacotherium, the size of a collie dog, all the way up to modern Equus, with all of the transitions with the toe-dropping Dinohippus and all that along the way, all in a kind, in a monobaramin, in a subset of a kind, how the hell can you keep Horacotherium and Homo galax from being connected? Two almost contemporaries that look almost alike, one of which goes off to the tapirs and the other one goes off to the horses in normal evolutionary thinking. Well, on the line, and how can you do to keep the phenacodonts, the ancestors of all of them, connecting up? So they've got to use a sliding scale that's pretty vague, and the batteries run out constantly, where they're leaving out data in droves, and all you have to do is to start researching the science papers, because typically baraminology papers will be citing regular taxonomy papers. Why? Because they don't do the work. It's the scientists that do the work. It's the evolutionists that do the work. So when a baraminologist is taking all of these little cladistic numbers, all these ones and zeros and stuff that are used to run through their little mills to figure out what their baramins are, they're not doing this stuff on their own. They're siphoning it off of the evolutionists. So they're selective parasites. Yeah, old Scratch was saying that the only way baraminology could work is if creationism is true, and it doesn't work. So it's a good verification that creationism isn't true. And it's revealing that the intelligent designers don't even get that far. They make no attempt whatsoever to work out systematics. So they can simultaneously accept that there are millions and millions and millions and millions of years going on. Yet it doesn't occur to them to think, well, what's going on? How much of that's design? How many design events are there? What's going on during all of those millions of years of mammal evolution and millions of years of dinosaur evolution? It's a mess. And they're never going to make it fit. And any attempt to make it fit is going to look hilarious. And I'll bring popcorn for that. Animal Man asks, how do they explain synapsids are direct reptilian ancestors other than completely ignore them? You got that right. They completely ignore them. I'll do my book plug here, Evolution Slam Dunk, which is available in print format or in ebook formats for Nook and Kindle and all that kind of stuff. And there's links on my website, which if you don't know, shameless plug, all the links to all of that is in there. I went through all examples of anti-evolutionists on the reptile-mammal transition. It's not many, it's only some 20. And every single one of them is so far away from the data field, it hurts. Ironically, the creationists, Dwayne Gish and Charles Krieger and the little numbnuts at Truth in Science, would mention some sciencey stuff more than what you get over on the intelligent design side. When you look at how Pandas and People and Dembski and Wells's Design of Life and Steve Meyer and Company's Explore Evolution, and then the Mount Olympus of evasion, Michael Denton's new book that just came out last year that I went through. He had a little section on the reptile-mammal transition, and I just pull him to shreds on there because, boy, it is just a perfect example of how incredibly vague they are. Here's 100 million years worth of fossils showing a gradual acquisition of mammalian features, including that jaw transition thing, which involved predicted fossils. And it's got developmental biology, it's got genetic things, it's got some paleogenomic retroengineering in some cases. It's a huge block of data, and every one of them is missing it. Every one of them. I call that a pattern. And it's why I call the book Slam Dunk, because, boy, how you could look through, it made an evolutionist out of me. When I didn't start out as an evolutionary guy. It was kind of skepticism about Darwinism and that, but back in my high school days and that. And I only found out about the reptile-mammal transition years later in the 1980s, when the young Earth creationists were starting to run amok, and a guy wrote a section on it in a criticism of creationism. And I went, whoa, that's sure impressive. Because to get from a reptile to a mammal, some very specific things have to happen. Things that are visible in the fossils, not murky stuff that you'd need the DNA or soft tissues, although that would help. But stuff that's physically reflected in the bones, particularly the way the jaw is transitioning around and all this kind of stuff. And to see that happening, yeah, no, if God doesn't want me to believe in evolution, he shouldn't have created therapsids. That was just plain dumb, as I put it in the book. Now, Old Scratchy says they change the definition of kind to fit whatever point they try to make. There is a lot of that. Remember, you've got an awkward problem with the kind idea. And it's first that human beings have to be a special kind, period. No ifs, no ands, or buts. We got to be a kind all by our little lonesome, which means our species. But no creationist is willing to be happy with trying to have all the species on Noah's Ark. So now they have to start ferreting it out to trim it down. And the old traditional definition of kind is pretty much at the family level. And that's kind of how most kinds run. But sometimes they get even more if they really feel adventurous about it. And of course, you'd still have to deal with all the extinct ones. So how many therapsid kinds were there? And you know, where are the dimetrodons today? Wasn't the whole point of the ark to preserve everything? And therefore, why is it that for some weird reason, animals that are thought to have lived a long time ago, according to conventional chronology, by some weird coincidence, died out after they left the ark? I mean, you can see a little couple dimetrodons with their little fin backs. You can imagine them climbing down the side and Noah and the kids waving goodbye. Goodbye, Sammy, we really miss you. And the little dimetrodons go, I don't know where, back to South Africa. I don't know where they were going to the Karoo. And yet, poof, they all fizzle out. Whereas some of the other critters just do really well. So they're trying to square a circle, and it's never going to work. Because you got too many animals that exist now, and too many fossils that existed before, and too many transitional forms that exist, and too much genetics, and too much developmental biology that's known. Remember, if you want that slam dunk thing, remember, every mammal, every creationist, whoever opens their mouth is using the jaw that in their embryo was laid out in the reptile format, and was hinged on the reptile jaw hinge, and only in the course of developmental biology, in our embryos, did that dentary bone take over, and those extra jaw bones get pulled up to be the middle ear bones, and therefore, when they listen to you or not, or hear a choir singing, they are using the bones that are co-opted in our own evolutionary development. So there's irony on irony on irony about the reptile-mammal transition. It has none of the problems that the Cambrian explosion or bird evolution or origin of whales, every one of them has got some murky parts in their zones where you don't have a lot of data for very good reasons. But the reptile-mammal transition doesn't have those. They're traced by order, from order, from order, from order, boom, 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 all the way down the line. And it's so gradual and so smooth. When you finally get towards the actual mammals, when they're starting to show up, the full-blown, you know, the first placentals and things like that, there's a whole bunch of group called the Mammaliaformes that are the almost mammals that are just on the cusp. Exactly what you would expect if all evolution is relatively gradual and there's no big saltational leaps and it's all done by random mutations, and those sorts of mutations can occur in multiple lineages because they're very reasonable things to happen. And how anybody who could go through all of that data and not see full-blown support for macroevolution has got to just be blind as a bat. And when you look at how they do it, yeah, they're blind as a bat intellectually. I'll put in a little thing here, my shameless plug, and call me attention to our wonderful Patreons. I got to go over here and pull up my stupid little menu again to share screen. Boop, and there we go. And there are RJ's tip patrons. These are the ones who have put money into the Patreon thing for specifically these evolution hours. I will call attention to the tip website, tortugan.wordpress.com. And then there's also the GoFundMe, which is another neat way to give money even faster than Patreon does in any denominations at all, so that Jimmy might reach the point where I can be reasonably confident that I can print stuff up and be able to afford the ink. But anyway, I will stay to Stephen and John and Dyer and Eat and Yui and Mona and Hendril and Jen and Jody and Staggles and Alex and Totes Real and Paul. Thank you very, 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 very much for everybody that's been helping on this. I'm a ported nerd who is trying to make a difference on here one step at a time. And which brings us back to the topic at hand, which is that source method. That it's the universal toolkit. It's not something that applies to just the sciences. I use it just as much if I'm reading a historical paper, or if I'm looking at statistics on the budget deficits in terms of GDP, or voting records on the Civil Rights Act in 1964, or anything. or you're looking at ancient documents relating to whether or not Mithras cults were prevalent and contemporary with early Christianity and what their doctrines were, etc., etc. It's all the same method. And it's all the same method now that we're in the internet era. If you look at people who suffer from cranial blockage of the rectum, like Alex Jones or Dinesh D'Souza or Ann Coulter or a certain president of the United States, they all suffer from the inability to do good source methods. They'll rely upon a secondary source and not notice that they're relying on a secondary source. They won't fact check it to find out if it's a reliable secondary source. It says what they want to be true, and that's as far as they go. The same methodology that would apply if I'm reading that editorial in Nature magazine on the climate change data. They're all openings to investigate. And you'll find, I think, that you scratch the surface of somebody who believes something that isn't true, and they're going to use bad method. They won't know how to tell the difference between a primary and a secondary source. They won't know, they won't have enough gumption to look up primary sources, even if it's a mouse click away. They won't understand the content of it, even if you give them the source, and they probably won't read it anyway. And they'll just go on and repeat the same claim over and over again. Well, that won't cut it. And we've now reached the stage in civilization when we have such rapid access to information, and we also have such rapid access to stupid, that it's not the case that you had to wait for somebody to read the silly little flat earth pamphlet that the crank was handing out at the church hall. Instead, it's online, boom. And so if you don't have this armament system in your methods thing internalized, you can easily go down the rabbit hole. And then a lot of the people that can do that bad method, they end up voting. And look who they vote for. The stakes are way too high. So I'm a devout methodologist, and I'm trying to get a lot of converts. Everybody join the jamboree, because it's the way you think clearly. And it's a toolkit that will serve you well. It's fun. I love to find out stuff. There's a certain pernicious pleasure one can take when you discover that somebody's secondary source is a pile of shit, and you know it, and you can show exactly why. And a scholarship is a contact sport, gang. And the more we can learn about that, will there ever be a worldwide world of scholarly analysis to rival what we do with sporting events? And how well will Watson do? I imagine a Watson-style artificial intelligence would have to learn sound methodology to be able to ferret through what's true and false and what's reliable and what's unreliable. And if a bloody computer can do it, well, excuse me, we humans can do it too, okay? So, looking back over there, Israel, the intellectual rigor requires honesty. Yeah, remember my fascinating little word, tortukan, which is the word I described, the turtle mines that have mine shells that they easily deflect things they don't want to think about. And that is not a matter of dishonesty. It is a matter of laziness, and it is a matter of the brain basically short-circuiting their thinking before they even get to that part. So you'll find that I have no doubt in all the ones, since you've got my book, I've sent him the PDF version of it, kind of a roundabout, because he didn't want to go through the electronic thing, and so he paid for it through GoFundMe. Anybody can do that. I've done it once. I can do it again. So he effectively gets the CreateSpace print version, but in a PDF format. And as you read through that, you're going to see people who I have no doubt are as honest as all get out. They believe everything they write. But at a source methods level, you're going to peek under the hood, and you're going to see how their mind kind of shuts down at a certain point. They'll cite a reference. It may be a primary or maybe a secondary source, but they don't really explore it very far, and they don't go farther than do follow-up. They don't investigate stuff. They'll stop at the, well, this is my little comfort blankie. It says what I want to be true. And that's not a good method for rigorous thinking. That it involves gumption, it involves curiosity. So I would say that anti-evolutionists are not so much dishonest as gobsmackingly uncurious. They don't have that fire in the belly to want to know all the data and then make sense of all the data. No, they miss most of the data. And they can easily slough past it. So they literally don't have a map of time in their heads. They don't work out that stuff like where the mammoths are relative to the dinosaurs and all that kind of stuff. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm assuming that you were. Yes, I misunderstood. All I have communicated with was Azrael. I should use a more generic they rather than to assume. So I will assume that you are, therefore, a lady. There we go. Well, that shows you how even I can make faulty assumptions. I try actually to use gender-neutral things. I've always liked doing that, but you slip into stuff. And I'll also use guys generically just to refer to people in general, independent of sex there. So I apologize profusely for the inconvenience of it. Got another one. Au Folk de Voix. If you think mainstream creationists are silly, I met one Adventist pastor who claimed dinosaurs are reptile-bird hybrids created with genetic engineering by the pre-flood civilization. Woo! Boy, how the Adventists have gone off the rails. Modern young earth creationism stems from the Adventists. But what's funny is that an awful lot of current Adventists don't know that. And the one that you bumped into is basically making up his own shit. Because that's kind of a trope lore. In fact, I've heard a few other ex-Adventists talk about the fact that in homeschooling, they were having ones that were saying dinosaur bones, dinosaurs never existed at all. They were just faked up. So I think what you may have bumped into, Devois, is one of these seat of the pantsers that's running in kind of, they happen to be in an Adventist context, but basically they're making up shit. And they're drawing off of, there's a small lore of kind of alien hybrid, Zachariah Sitchin's meddling alien lizard creatures, and bits and pieces of that. In fact, there's this guy, Brandon, that I've been jousting with on Twitter just today, who kind of comes from that background. And you get these ones that they're the smorgasborder types, where they're just taking little bits and pieces of stuff and making their own creationism as like a craft project. And yeah, it comes out pretty weird. BJ says when she was the seventh day, dinosaurs were planted by Satan. Yeah, that's another trope. It's not an official doctrine. I've never really seen it pushed at the upper level, and it certainly doesn't pop up in any conventional creationist lore. Answers in Genesis and ICR, even Kent Hovind. But of course, all of his creationism was kind of congealed back in the 1970s, so he's pretty behind the scenes on a lot of that stuff. Yeah, so what you've got then is when you don't really have a systematic system involved, a doctrinal thing, the grassroots will start making it up and go in their own little way and improvising. And they'll draw off, particularly in the internet era, there's so much claptrap to run off of. You find a bit of this intersection going on with the flat earthers, who are usually biblical flat earthers. That's been the traditional lore. You may find a few non-ones, but it's not unusual to find them as being effectively biblical cosmology. And they'll draw off of a bunch of different things. We had just one, another one that I was jousting with just today was pushing Lemuria. And he had a book and a video talking about Lemuria. Excuse me, no, how did you check this? Because I know where Lemuria comes from. It's a made-up continent that Helena Blavatsky, the Theosophist, concocted back in the 19th century. And then this other guy, Churchwood, in the 1930s, decided to upstage her and come up with Mu in the Pacific, which Lemuria was the suburbs. And it was just drawing silly crap out on maps. It's geologically preposterous. And I was asking him, go right ahead, show me the geology to show that any of these places existed in the archaeology. Not some stupid book that you read or some video based on that. No, give me some science data. I'm not holding my breath on that one. Oh, Animal Man asks, can you talk about the possibility of cloning woolly mammoths? Yeah, that's a fun one because you do actually have DNA available for that. I think it's fragmentary. In fact, we've got a better set of DNA from Neanderthals. because a lot of the mammoths are actually rather older than some of the most recent Neanderthal things, and we interbreeded with Neanderthals, so we've actually got some of that knocking around in some of our own DNA. It's tricky. Even if you could reconstitute the full DNA genome for a mammoth, elephants are social creatures, and it would be kind of sad even if you generated a single woolly mammoth using an elephant as a surrogate mother and all of that. It's all by its poor little lonesome. We're really discovering that it's kind of sad to have zoos in general because animals are taken out of their natural context, and elephants are just incredibly social creatures. And so you would need to have a population of them, and then you would also still be missing the culture of the mammoths. So although as an intellectual exercise, it's certainly fascinating, and I wouldn't recommend storming the science groups, you know, with stakes like something, burning torches like something out of a Frankenstein movie, if they did it, I would be on that unless they were really wanting to find some genuine insight about such a cloning effort, it's probably kind of a sad waste of time. Okay, we're at 5:56, almost ready to go off on the show. Any further questions popping up out in the live chat there? I'll do a brief summary of the point at issue, which is about sound methodology, and that scholarship, the looking up of primary sources, the making use of tools, so where you recognize a secondary source like a Wikipedia article or a summary article or a newspaper account is a secondary source, and never, ever, ever forget that it's a secondary source. It may be a very reliable one, but it's always that secondary level. And when you want to get serious, especially if you're planning on debating with creationists or ideologues or whoever, knowing the primary source material not only grounds you in a more defensive mode, but it also means you know the data firsthand and you don't have to rely on somebody else's filtering of it. And you can get off onto tangents and not realize it if you're relying too heavily on secondary source material. Animal Man puts in non-evolutionist logic of feathered dinosaurs. Uranus is a giant flightless, tooth-jawed, three-fingered on powerful arm, long-tailed bird. Yeah, great logic. Yeah. The funniest one, and Richard Prubb, the guy I mentioned that did the bird feather embryology work, was just gobsmacked with amusement when Alan Fiducia, who had for years been insisting that coelurosaurs were not related to birds. They just coincidentally resembled them anatomically, but they weren't really involved with them. If you look at some of the little small Compsognathus bunch, the little pack animals that attacked the guy in the second Jurassic Park movie, those are examples of these bird-like dinosaurs. When they started finding feathered coelurosaurs in China, he turns around 180 degrees, and the very same animals are now in his taxonomy flightless birds that just have a coincidental resemblance to dinosaurs. Yeah, no, that's not going to cut it. Same animals, same characteristics, just because it flip-flops, because he's got to be on one side or another. I pointed out in other things on systematics that one of the pitfalls of the binomial genera species approach that Linnaeus set up for taxonomy is that it doesn't really allow for almosts. So evolutionary transition, species that are starting to generate allopatric fissionings, which is geographical speciation, the system just doesn't handle that well. You can have a thing where you would have a subspecies, presumably, that would eventually be retaxonomized as its own separate species, but it suddenly flips from one species to another. You don't have an almost. You don't have iffies. And yet we find, if you look in the big picture, that an awful lot of animal cases, including in our own lineage, when you find transitions taking place that are fairly big ones, you've got this zone of uncertainty where there are a bunch of taxonomical ones where there's a big debate over how they're to be classified. Well, that's a dead giveaway that you're looking at a transitional sequence, because they don't know which side of the fence to peg them on. The classic example is still Homo habilis versus the Australopithecines. That sounds like a great idea for an action-adventure story. But score by Hans Zimmer. But to this day, there is still a legitimate point to be made that is Homo habilis actually the first legitimate Homo genus critter, or is it just the most advanced of the Australopithecines? So would it be just as fair to call it Australopithecus habilis? And that's the kind of pitfalls that you inevitably get into in a taxonomical system that's got to be one or the other in the generic level, and in which everything can theoretically be undergoing transitions and turning into something fresh and new. So here we are, 6 o'clock. We've hit the end of our hour. And I hope I've answered some questions and a little bit side on and got somebody's gender right. And make sure that we get that smooth. And hopefully then we'll be still in existence and with the power on to do Evolution Hour 31. 30 episodes! We've done 30 weeks of these things. And I hope I've been informative. I always love questions, so anybody can Twitter me or go on to the TIP website and suggest things, or those who have email access, give me a topic. Remember, I'm live feed. Everybody who isn't on Twitter, why not, before it goes extinct? I'm RJ Downard on Twitter. Boy, I'm original. Everybody can tweet me direct and ask me questions on things and hopefully pick my brain. I know quite a few people have, Pelagia and Jackson Wheat and others pick my brain, and I go, I'm glad to do so, because I've been at this quite a long time. I built up a huge data set of material at that website that everybody should have bookmarked, and hopefully we'll get a lot more done. Okay, so Twitter, as I'll say, I post occasionally on Facebook, but a lot of those, I pointed out to people before, there's an interesting structure to Twitter, and there may be other social media that function the same way. But Twitter is linear in format. It's not like a separate set of boxes. And it's often easy to lose track of conversation threads on a Facebook format where you have a bunch of little separate little boxes that pop up once in a while, and then you kind of forget about them. But Twitter is a continuous roll of everybody that you follow, and you can kind of scroll down, especially if you keep track of it on the fly, which I do when I'm not away from home or sleeping, is you can kind of see stuff that's popping up and decide, okay, I'm going to jump in on that one or not. And then, of course, there's the mentions section where we'll tell you where anybody has alluded to or commented on something of which you are in that thread, and then you can triage whether or not it's important or not. My basic principle is anybody that says anything stupid, I may very well point out why it's stupid. And if I make a position, I try to defend it, and if anybody wants to challenge me on it, well, jolly well, I'm there to do so. And a question I really love is, says, oh, is that what you think? Well, what evidence do you have of that? Let me fire it. And that's exactly what I do. So anyway, I will be shutting off now, and we'll see you all next week. And I hope this was another useful hour. Au revoir, auf Wiedersehen, aloha.